This is a really, really exciting session. JD Bothma of OpenUp in South Africa will share how to get the best out of Civic Tech through a presentation that will include discussion around requirements analysis, paper prototyping, and user testing. And JD Bothma is a software developer for OpenUp South Africa. He uses his experience and knowledge of how innovation and development can happen quickly and reliably in the tech industry to bring the same efficiencies and improvements in communication and collaboration between the state, civil society, and the public. We're really excited to have you here, JD. Thank you so much. And that is all from me now. I'll let you take the reins, JD.
Cool. Hi, thank you very much. It's really, really cool to be here. I'm really happy that the next talk after this is about user testing and research and all of that. I think it's really going to follow on nicely from what I'm going to talk about. And that's especially an area that I don't go into too much because I'm far from an expert there. So I'm just going to stop my video. I just wanted to sort of say hi, and then I'll try and make sure that there's the maximum bandwidth available. Right, so yeah, this title, How to Get the Best from Civic Tech, got really lofty, and I added projects at the end because it's really focusing on projects and just running projects. In a very practical sense, I've looked at sort of how a lot of our projects go wrong or how we get frustrated. So yeah, this doesn't mean to encompass all kinds of civic tech projects. It doesn't address all the challenges you will encounter. So this is really just us trying to work as effectively as possible. And we've had many different arrangements of people, different kinds of projects. We've got very different skill sets. I'll talk a little bit about what sort of people work for us. We each contribute different things depending on our backgrounds and our skills. And we have regular retrospectives, or we try to have regular retrospectives on all projects, and reflect as teams and sometimes as stakeholders, ideally, to raise concerns and frustrations and issues, and then try small changes to how we work and see if those changes can address the problems. And what often happens is that the problems go away, perhaps because we've made a change that sorted it out, or just because the team is aware of it, and by being aware of it, our behavior changes, or just that attention has shifted and this isn't a priority anymore. So to be sustainable, and we've been going for a good 6 years, and I've been there for 4.5 years or so. And even as we want to scale our work up, we've noticed the need to make things explicit, and not just sort of make the change and then not realize sort of that this is supposed to be something we should do all the time. And so I'm trying to make things explicit for us internally, and as part of that, I'm sharing that with you. And also, if we're explicit about what it is that we believe makes our projects work well, we're able to validate that those things are really the things that that are leading to success. So yeah, this comes out of that work. So let me see if I can make this more full screen. There we go. So I'll have this little outline in a few places in the talk. First, I'm just going to give you a bit of context of what OpenUp does. I'm going to talk about our fears and failures and common mistakes. Then we'll talk about key considerations that we believe should really be paid attention to in all projects. Then I'll show you sort of a very simplified version of basically many common practices that end up working well, that I'm going to just call our sort of project approach. And then there's time for a practical to try that approach out on your projects and see if you can learn something and if it might be helpful for you. And finally, we'll recap. I think at the end of key considerations, just before we go into tools, I'll stop for questions, and also at the end of tools and approach. But let's see how the time looks. So who is OpenUp and what do we do? Our vision is a South Africa where citizens and government are empowered to thrive collaboratively. Our mission is that OpenUp seeks to empower people and government through data, technology, and innovative thinking to become active agents in creating positive social change. So I'll just touch on a few of our projects. One called Bothma tries to make census data easily accessible, both just to view and understand, but also to download snippets of that are particularly interesting to you as data. And it's based on Census Reporter. And one issue we have with this is that there's no clear next step or action. You need to know what you're going to use this information for. Another project called Municipal Money does kind of a similar thing for local government financial data. And it shows contact details for the leadership of every municipality, which is what we call a local government in South Africa, for like a city or a rural region. It has easy to read indicators, and we treat missing data as data, because if, for example, at a certain point in time, cash balance isn't being shown, isn't available for this financial year, that tells you something about the municipality and their ability to manage themselves. Because all of this data is submitted to the central national treasury, or is supposed to be. And there's still this problem that the next steps are still unclear. There are the contact details, but as a sort of a general citizen, you might not know what you can expect of them, what you might contact them for, who you should contact for what sort of problem, and what other next steps there are available to you. Another project is called CodeBridge Youth, and we're basically trying to set up civic participation groups and meet young people where they are in each of their own municipality. And Matsikama is one municipality in South Africa. And it's an opportunity for the young people to upskill, because we bring things like data handling in, and also how to participate in more formal processes. And we try and tap into existing processes, and we work in collaboration with the local municipality. So it's not something we try and set up where a local government is adversarial or not interested. It's really in participation, which is a really cool thing. And then related to this project is a local government planning guide. So the IDP mentioned up here is just the term for a legislated process in South Africa for local government planning that happens every year, and it's sort of a 5-year planning cycle. This tool is cool. It really unpacks the sort of the planning process and opportunities for participation, but it still doesn't show actual meeting dates or venues or anything like that. So you still have to go and find where you can actually go and submit comment or attend a meeting. So how would we define success at OpenUp? We're more upset about not knowing whether something has the intended effect or not knowing why it doesn't have the intended effect than we are about not seeing the intended effect. Because by learning as quickly as possible what doesn't work and perhaps why, we can more quickly move on to other things that would have the intended effect. So to be honest with you, we're really bad at this, which is another reason why I'm so excited about the upcoming talk. One reason is that we just get caught up in the concrete everyday objective of the project, trying to get people to use it, trying to get something we think is sufficient out the door. And then you kind of move on to the next thing, and you neglect sort of reviewing and seeing how well this is actually being used. So looking at OpenUp in numbers, and I know this is a lot of context, but I think it helps to understand sort of the variety of what we do. I mean, we just struggle a lot with this. I don't know if other people struggle with the things that I'm going to be talking about, but I think it helps to get a sense of the sort of things we work with. Over the last 6 years, we've probably had about, on average, 12 core team members, going between 8 and 20, but yeah, on average 12 core team members, and then 3 internalized contractors. So people who aren't full-time employees, but they're really like gelled into the company. Over that time, we've worked on about 60 projects that are bigger than just a quick data visualization. And that might be one person working for about 50% of their time for 2 weeks on the project. to 3 people working for about 70% for 3 years. So there's a massive range, and everything in between, a massive range of sizes and scales of project. Some of our projects are our own and funded by grants we apply for. Some projects are driven by other nonprofits and either funded by grants they receive or their own funding sources, or funding we apply for together. And some projects are with government, where we bid on a contract, they're advertising. And we do that when there's an opportunity to do something in line with our vision, but the relationship with them is like a client and service supplier, where we've won a competitive tender with in the government sort of procurement process. And the most important statistic of all is that this equates to roughly $3,500 US dollars on coffee. So let's look at our fears. There might be some things that we worry might happen. Most of these things have happened on one or more projects, and we don't want to repeat these things. So we worry that we do something that already existed and that our work was superfluous, or that we do something but it's not used, or that we do something but it doesn't actually solve the user's problem, or that it doesn't actually meet our objective, or that we start doing something and it becomes too expensive and has to stop, or we just have to take money from elsewhere to finish it, or that we start doing something and the project doesn't get finished for some other reason, or that we just end up checking boxes on a contract because we have to meet contractual obligations, and that's really not cool if you're just checking the boxes, but you lose the spirit of the project. But perhaps most of all, that we worry that we don't know if anyone is using it or succeeding. That's just this growing fear inside ourselves, because sometimes things just move so fast. So now I'm going to very rapidly touch on 15 key considerations. So I can't see the chat, so just shout out if I need to stop or something like that. Yeah, so I'll quickly touch on 15 key considerations. You don't need to remember them. The important thing is that you might notice something that you didn't think of before, because probably most of these things are things I didn't realize were important considerations to have in a project. And since we're often quite small teams in a project, there's a lot of things that 2 people will not be aware of and will be missing out. And that's what I was trying to sort of elicit here. So for us, it's still not clear who owns each of these areas. Each team member might have multiple responsibilities. The first step is just to make these things explicit, so that we can start having them on our radar. Once I've gone through these considerations, we'll zoom out and see how they might be grouped into broad areas of responsibility and start seeing how you could apply those roles to a team. It's okay if you would use different names for these things, and I'd really love to hear what those other names for these things are, or considerations that I've missed out that from your experience are key things, and there will be an opportunity to mention that later. So for domain knowledge, I don't know if that's a bit of a technical term, but whether the project is about government finances or about healthcare, someone has to understand the field that you're working in. So for example, perhaps an accountant knows how to read financial statements. Perhaps we do internally in our team because we've looked at a few before. But do we really understand the consequences for a local government being in a certain financial state? What mechanisms are available to address that? Can we partner with someone who does if we don't? How will we ensure that we are technically correct and that we don't misrepresent something subtle but important? User research is it's quite a big deal. The people who will be interacting with whatever interventions we're implementing in a project, we need to have an idea who they are and what they're trying to achieve and what motivates them, so that we can tap into that. What motivates them to take action, and how they fit into the bigger picture of the area that we're trying to address. It's also good to be explicit about the kinds of users your project will not be trying to serve, perhaps because they're too hard to reach right now, and you'd end up just not doing a good job on something where you could actually get something out and that would be useful. Visual design, I won't go into too much. You might realize I don't know too much about visual design, but it's not just about your website looking pretty. It can really build trust in your tool, both for your users and for your clients. And it might make interactions with your tool easier. And I'm separating visual design and user experience design. You'll see more on that later. When we talk about tracking requirements, I mean actually writing them down and keeping them up to date. So what's the highest priority user need? What's not clear yet, but might be worth looking at later? It really helps to have something to point to when discussing a user need, somewhere where you can clarify what we mean by this user need, where you can write a note or something like that. You also need to identify who's responsible for keeping it up to date. Who has the final say in deciding what the scope is of a certain feature, and what the priority is between two features. Administration for me was always, and still is very much actually, the mind-numbing, tedious stuff. But when you realize how it enables the project and organization to work effectively and sustainably, it becomes part of it becomes a cog in this really interesting machine. But still, like, sometimes admin is just boring. It blew my mind when I realized, when I was responsible for a project budget and trying to just not overspend and spend more money than we have for this project. And I realized that it's also actually really problematic if you underspend on a project, if you're not spending enough fast enough, because you're running out of the time available for this money to be spent. And at some point, it's just a wasted opportunity. So it's not just overspending that you need to watch out for. In management accounting, they say you can't manage what you can't measure. So if you're not measuring things like the money available and the time spent each month, you're probably not managing that money effectively. And I've used the word compliance here. I'm not sure if it's quite right, but there's a few things I want to touch on. While we try to focus 110% on the spirit of the problem that we're trying to address, and what would be useful to actual users out there in the real world, you still need to adhere to any contracts on the project, any legal requirements relevant to the project, or regulations, and your internal process of good governance. Those things can't just fly out the window because you're just focusing on serving user needs. And then someone has to create content, depending on the project, but there's always some kind of sense of content, even if it is just like the labels of buttons. Unless you're really lucky to be able to copy information from somewhere and use it directly in your project, someone has to do research and find the structure and compose that content into something that fits together as a whole. Someone has to gather the correct links, like we've got sort of contextual links here under a certain section. Yeah, put them in the right place. And someone has to condense information to the right length for the medium you're using to convey it. Someone has to write a video script. They don't write themselves, and they're not the same as a guide, as a text guide, for example. Is this going to be your domain expert or a researcher, or is your programmer good at writing content? I laugh because most of us aren't. And what's going to be the most cost-effective way of preparing this content for your project? Then medium expertise is, again, this term I've made up. There's more to publishing information than just the words. There's how you use visual aids along with the words. There are things that are very particular to a medium. In this example, I show a government website, which is an incredibly rich resource. But for some reason, it just doesn't show up in Google search results. So if your medium is the web, you need someone who understands publishing to the web and helping people to find that and use that. If you're making a video, someone needs to think about how you tell your story with that medium. It's the same for a booklet. Is the content arranged similarly in a booklet from a website? That's a decision you probably ought to make. And then you have to use language that the user will understand. In this screenshot, the national government in South Africa wrote Section 32, referring to a section of an act, a law, which specifies in-year public reporting requirements. How many people do you think will know what Section 32 refers to? So what use is this public reporting they're clearly just checking a box, complying with the law. You want to catch your audience's eye with what they are looking for, what they expect to see. You don't want to scare them away. At the same time, a lot of the time in civic tech work, the user will eventually have to use a technical term in their engagement with government. So you can't act like technical terms don't exist. You might need to find a way to make a connection between the technical term and the common language for the term, for the concept. Also, if you're trying to help more specialized audience, like experts with the same tool, you should be careful that it's not so basic that they think that it's not relevant to them because it's only very simple language and it doesn't actually cater for experts. So you need to be consistent on your site and make a decision. Are you using technical terms? Are you using common language? And what system are you using to connect the two? So I didn't really know what image to use for technical leadership, but for us, technical leadership is exploring how tech can help address a problem. And when no code or non-tech things might be more appropriate, or solutions might be more appropriate to this project or this area of a project. And we need to be aware of the hidden costs of writing code and using a lot of technology. Bad decisions can have a significant cost. In industry, a fairly junior team is often given a massive amount of space to try and learn and just try until they figure out a way of solving something. But for us doing many small experimental projects, this has just proved unaffordable. So we really prioritize having some senior technical person help make decisions. Senior technical people also understand the hidden and the long-term costs and the effort needed to keep something running for a long time better than more junior people would, because they just haven't seen sort of what breaks over time. And of course, if you do decide to build something new, someone is going to have to build it. Under community management, someone will probably have to talk to users if you're building up a community. And sort of it's not just sort of one person using something individually, but they have a way of interacting or something like that. It keeps, and someone has to keep in touch with them. Is your software developer able to relate with the intended audience? Or who in your time has the time and skill to do this? If you open the door to sort of a community and a dialogue, there's a risk of putting people off when you're not able to respond. Testing and evaluation, you can and should check with potential and actual users whether you're on the right track at every stage of the process. You want to be doing this to discover that you might not be on the right track. You might have made some incorrect assumptions, and you want to discover that as early as possible and minimize waste. And there's a range of ways of trying stuff with different levels of fidelity, it's called, to learn whether you're on the right track and fail early. Then ultimately, someone has to bring it all together conceptually and strategically. Someone has to look at all of these considerations and pull them together in the project context. Someone has to hold the vision and own that vision and relate the vision to the reality of how much money and time and what skills you have available to address this problem. Someone has to make overarching decisions, and someone should care that the information in the various pieces of your project is consistent. And as the project evolves, it evolves in a way that it doesn't become disjointed because you're giving one area attention and not updating this other area that's based on before you've learned a lot. And I really want to sort of emphasize, these are a lot of considerations, and we certainly don't have one person per thing. We don't have experts in all of them, but by being explicit about the fact that these things exist and are important to a project, we can more easily see where the gaps are and what we're forgetting. When I try to group these considerations into something that makes sense to me, where I would go and ask someone to take care of this issue, these are roughly the groups I came up with. I've put sort of domain knowledge, tracking requirements, and bringing it all together under project definition, compliance and administration, and I'm missing out sort of coordination, under project management. Under implementation, there's the tech stuff like technical leadership and implementation, the non-tech stuff like creating content and community management, and visual design kind of is this bridge between user experience and the basic implementation. And under user experience, I've got user research, medium expertise, writing for the user, and user testing. And I know there's a lot more to it. I think it doesn't matter if you would group things differently. In reality, when we have a team of like 2.5 people, the responsibility for these considerations float around a bit. But it helps us to start having an idea for who's going to wear a certain hat in a given team. And as the team evolves, perhaps how that arrangement should move. And I added these headings, by the way, after grouping things, but we can talk about the method later if that applies. So what happens to us a lot at OpenUp, certainly in the past, is that we would stick a developer on a project thinking this is a smart person, they'll figure it out. I'm one of those developers. The shading represents the neglect of these considerations. So I made the project definition and the user experience and visual design sort of shading a bit softer than the non-tech and project management shading, because I like to consider myself a well-rounded developer, and maybe I would do a decent job of the tech side and an okay job of project definition and user experience. But it's really hard actually to switch between big picture thinking of bringing it all together, and so this high level stuff, and deciding how to structure data in the database, lower level technical things, how to connect one system to another in a robust way, and how to handle missing data. So jumping between this high level and low level stuff is really, really tough. And yeah, I reduced this shading on the visual design concern because there are tools that I can use as a person who doesn't know much about design, but I can still end up with a pretty decent looking thing just by using those tools. But it's certainly not properly dealt with. If you add a project manager to the mix, at least that stuff should be taken care of now. Someone should be able to hold the big picture while the techie is deep in the details. It's a lot better, but there are still big gaps. The name we give to the person who's responsible for the project vision normally, and bringing everything together, defining a project, is called we call a product owner. This term comes from the Scrum methodology, which is usually about software products, but really it can be applied to any kind of project. I'll talk about this role in Scrum in a moment, but just in this picture, the product owner might be the project manager. That could be the same person, but they probably shouldn't be part of the implementing team. That's more sort of on this end. Saying that, adding a product owner, you should see more attention coming to the remaining considerations. But unless they really possess these skills and are aware of what goes into user experience design, and have sufficient time for that, these considerations are not sufficiently solved, or not solved very well until they're delegated to someone who is competent. So just to touch a little bit more on a product owner in the Scrum methodology. I'll talk more about Scrum, the methodology at the end, but the fundamentals of a product owner is really someone who someone in your team might already be doing a lot of these things. We just find it helpful to have a name for it, so that we can say, who's the product owner? Who is responsible for these aspects? You don't have to be building a product to have a product owner. The role is really about defining a vision for a project, and understanding what you're trying to achieve, understanding the problem space, and making decisions that maximize the value of work done. That's what it's about. So it very much applies to projects in the Civic Tech space, even if you're not making a product. And I know this role exists in other spaces as well. With this name or otherwise, we use Scrum because it brings some great approaches for working and communicating effectively inside the team, and with other stakeholders. So there's usually a range of other non-tech implementation work. Researchers and journalists have contributed a lot to our projects. We haven't really had explicit community managers, but we're going into that space a bit, like I mentioned with the youth project. So that's becoming an area we do need to pay attention to. And finally, but certainly not least, the person who really understands user experience is often called a user experience designer. We've only brought someone in to a project on a few occasions, someone who really is a user experience designer. And sometimes that's because we have good coverage in the team of software developers who've studied this and who know this. And sometimes just because we've neglected it, we've forgotten about it. And on occasion, we've realized quite late that there's no awareness in the team of this area, and that someone has to pay attention to it. So I think at this point, I want to ask, are there any questions or anything I've missed that you think that you would say from your experience is really important?
I have a question if others don't have a question. I was actually just kind of looking at the numbers of kind of people involved on a project, which I would say like all of these definitely seem, and in my experience, relevant and important to have on the team. But it is also, it is also my experience that a lot of civic tech kind of organizations and civic tech projects don't have that many resources. And so I'm actually interested, I mean, in what has been like the most important kind of things to remember, like the most important considerations when your resources are, you know, really low and you can only have 3 people on a team or 3 people on a project.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I mentioned, a lot of the time, most of the time on a project, we only have 2 people, and
right.
We might sort of have someone help out a little bit. And what we're doing more and more is just using contractors on Upwork, for example, to bring someone in who can do a certain job. Certainly a lot of like the basic technical implementation, by outsourcing the implementation part that can be specified quite clearly. The technical people with a bit more skill can focus on that. So if you do end up actually building something, you need someone who can build something, or who can tell someone else to build something and check that it actually works and integrate it to make sure it works. So you usually don't get away from this if you are doing if you are building new tech, or you need someone like a project manager or just someone else who knows enough about how to use no-code solutions like Webflow, Google, the whole Google suite, all of those things, Zapier, to put something together without like writing code. So that kind of stuff you can't get away from. And I think the process we're going to look at in a moment tries to help you to have this project definition in place. I think I tend to insist on, even if it's a team of 2 people, to make it explicit who wears the product owner hat, because that, like, it's a lot easier if one person is making prioritizing decisions and has the final say. It's also a lot of responsibility. I've got a whole spiel that I think I skipped for time on the relationship between the product owner and the team. And it's not like a boss relationship. It's just the poor person who has the responsibility to make the decision on these things. And then, so basically what I'm getting at is someone is going to have to keep track of the budget, right? Someone is going to have to make prioritizing decisions and decide what we're trying to solve and what we're going to leave until later or skip. You don't get away from that just by having 2 people. You might be doing it explicitly or implicitly. Someone has to implement something. And this is why user experience often ends up being neglected. So I don't think you necessarily need a user experience person. And I guess my goal here is to make sure that either your developer or your implementer or your person responsible for the project management and the decisions needs to know what questions to ask. I think that's really the fundamental, what it comes down to. And this comes out of actually us realizing that when there aren't sort of experienced technical people on a project, because a project can totally be handled by people who are not from the software industry, because you don't need to write code. It can just be like a designer and a project manager who can achieve a massive amount. They don't come from the space where user experience design and agile is like your day-to-day. So this just gets completely forgotten. And then a long way into a project, you realize that there's this gap. You've lost track of a crystal clear focus on the vision of the project, and you're not tracking requirements or in an effective way. So yeah, at the end of the day, having two people is not the problem. The problem is when they're not aware that these considerations are quite important for an effective project.
Yeah, thank you. That makes total sense. So yeah, just being very clear on like, these are the things that need to be in a project and who's going to wear those hats, and being very purposeful with that kind of, with those different tasks.
Yeah. And there's an open, it's not a debate really, but it's like, we haven't decided that it's truly the case, but we suspect that a lot of our projects only really have one or two people working a large part of their day on that project for a period of time. And it's a lot of hats, and there might be a second project and I might need to lend my sort of technical skills on 3 or 4 projects, and that spreads me quite thin. And there's a lot of overhead in switching between that. But at the same time, there are enough people able to sort of own a project and have different things going on. So what happens is we're switching between a lot of projects at the same time. But the nature of a lot of Civic Tech projects, for us at least, is that you often make a bit of progress and then you're blocked waiting for something like another NGO who needs to do something, or government who needs to provide some data or something like that. So you can't just sit down and work for 1 week or 2 weeks or 2 months and get it done. So you do have to switch between projects. And I think that that overhead actually ends up being all right. We're trying to consciously say this overhead is all right because as long as we're always learning on our projects, it makes sense to do these small projects. Big projects are nice in the sense that you get that efficiency, but often there's also a lot more waste if everything doesn't just come together all at once. So I think I don't want to drift too far, but the point there is it's a lot of hats to wear. It's a lot of different things to own for 2 people. But we think that overhead does actually make sense. Any other questions or anything that someone wants to add before I move on? Cool, I think I'll go on. So one thing I did realize I missed is communications, like who's tweeting about your project and trying to get it out there, marketing. And there was something else as well, but anyway. So yeah, this is not individuals. It's really a lot of things shared by a small number of people usually. Okay, our approach and tools we use here. This is a high-level view of our project process, and it probably looks very familiar. It's not my work, it's just my way of making sense of how it comes together, and particularly how a few different views of a project come together. Those being like the traditional project management way of looking at something, the agile approach from the software industry, and user experience design, because agile doesn't necessarily speak to user experience design, and user experience design doesn't tell you how to run a project. And neither of those talk to project management. The dark blue boxes represent steps in the process. And I've just been making up these names as I've been discussing it with colleagues and trying to document it. There are probably better terms for this, and you're welcome to tell me so later. And yeah, this was derived from lots of conversations, and it wasn't something I sort of invented. So it very much represents other standardized processes as well. The lighter boxes represent outputs or artifacts from this stage, things that we produce or that users can that users can use, or that we as a team can use, or that the client can use. And they are technical terms, so please do Google those. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail except for storyboarding. On the next slide, I've got some questions that will help explore these areas a little bit. But basically, we start with the intended outcome, clearly stating what you're trying to achieve. You define your project vision and your objectives. You then look at the people that are involved or affected by this project vision. Potential users, decision makers, data owners. We go quite broad here. And then you want to understand the state of the world. So what already exists in this space, in this problem area? How can you build on that? Or perhaps should you not build on that, but just help them succeed? At the same time, and maybe in conjunction, you should consider how users could succeed, what mechanisms exist for them to effect change. And finally, you can build something or try doing something. You're not necessarily building an app all the time. And perhaps you're doing some basic version of your intervention and getting that out there and seeing how well it works. Seeing if you should adjust your ideas a bit, or try again and try something different. Or maybe you realize that you're ready to scale up. At this evaluation step, I'm not just talking about users, right? I'm talking about your clients as well, and domain experts, because they might be able to tell you, now that they see what you really mean with what you've been talking about, that you've actually misunderstood something and you need to adjust. It's also okay to go back and update these things as you learn. But what I want to emphasize here is this strong loop on building something small, getting it out into the real world, in front of people outside of your bubble, and then learning and building on top of that. But it's also, I'll talk about this later, but it's also easy to jump into this thing. You can do iteration really well, but as techies, I think we easily neglect this early homework stuff. Okay, I do want to go through these questions quickly, because I think they're helpful in a project, and they also help to understand what we mean here. Under intended outcome, we might ask, what do we want to achieve? Why do we think that our idea will achieve that? And when we're working with a client, we also ask ourselves, should we help the client with this stage? Do they have it in hand, or should we give them a hand? Because most of our clients, it seems, don't think about this as much as we do. Under who's involved, we ask things like, what motivates the users? What tools do they already use? What background knowledge do they have? Do they have sufficient knowledge? And how educated are they? Under the information architecture, or really like the state of the world generally, we look at what data is available and ready to use, already in the public domain, or is it already in the public domain? What information is out there? What mechanisms exist? Under how the users could succeed, we look at where they are located, how they might find our work, and what all the steps are involved for them beyond our app. And I'll talk about the scope of what this is, of like how wide in this world of the user we're looking at. Under building and trying, we ask, what is the smallest thing we can do to validate our idea? And this kind of shows you an idea of fidelity. You can start with wireframes, you can go up to mockups. Design system is something that once you sort of have something here, you can start putting a design system together. and then I messed up prototype. You can have a prototype and then an MVP, and then iterate on those. What is the core feature? If you're adding a feature, what's the core of this? And what can we actually leave until later? And then under evaluation, you might ask a user things like, what do you understand from what you see here? Or what do you not understand from what you see here? And like I said, you might ask the client, what have we misunderstood from the problem space? So, of course, like we've just discussed, the degree to which you do this depends on the scale of a project. For a 2-week project, it might be some notes and or sketches. You can treat each artifact like a heading in a document, in one document. For a 2-year project, each deliverable might make more sense as like a one or more document, and perhaps some posters or things you can put on the wall. You might want to document your methodology for coming up with your vision or your user stories or something like that. So that 6 months later, you actually have an idea of where this came from. And if you're from the project management space or the NGO space, this roughly applies, not quite on this linear scale, but on to vision, mission, objectives, outcomes, and then activities. And I think evaluation probably ought to be here as well. I said I will talk about the scope and how far around your intervention or your app or your website in the user's world we're looking at. And I want to use storyboarding as an example. And please note, I'm not an expert, so please correct me if I'm doing this wrong, but I think I've got the gist of it. We've got a storyboard here of our local government finance project. And I want to go through the frames quickly, and then we'll look at the key things that is going to tell us about the scope that we want to look at. We start with, okay, so we've got this guy who's got undrinkable tap water, and he's sad. He asks himself what he's paying for. So he Googles or he searches for water budget and his city name. And he sees, let's say this is our intervention. We make a website that shows financial data on a chart. He sees there's underspending on water infrastructure and contact details of the political representatives. He speaks to a political representative and they go to a council meeting and they raise this issue, and they've got data in their hand. They show that there's unspent money. And that meeting is the start of a process that fixes water infrastructure being neglected, and they start prioritizing it, and that's fixed. And in the end, he's got safe water to drink. So the important thing here is that the starting point for the storyboard, and really the frame in which we're thinking about this whole process, is this trigger point of what prompts the user to start going down this journey. Then we do the end point. Where do we want to be? We want the user to have safe drinking water. The issue here, if we take a step back, the issue is that water infrastructure was in disrepair. So that needs to get fixed for the water to be drinkable. I'm going to jump over here now. So looking at the state of the world showed us that there's budget and spending data that can show this underspending on water infrastructure. And there's also a database of local public officials and elected representatives who can be petitioned about this issue. Filling this gap between our intervention and change happening is the elected official who has the information at hand and can get to the bottom of it. And it's also really important to look at, or to think of how people will actually get in touch, get in contact with your intervention, where they will meet it. And this depends on who you're targeting. If it's a web thing, you need to use search terms that or terms on your site that will lead people to your site via Google searches. So yeah, I think that gives you a sense of when we're asking these questions about a project, we're not just talking about the app idea you have or the website or whatever intervention you're talking about. Using our process chart then, we can plot the project budget over time. and see that we're this early research stage. Talking and asking questions and doing research costs time and money. And the line goes down a little bit. We then see that sort of doing a number of iterations of building and ideally also evaluation costs time and money. And I'm just compressing this time scale here because you're doing a bunch of loops here. There's nothing complicated there. If we forget evaluation and we just keep sort of building and building and building, your budget still goes down, right? And you may come to the end of your project and think, perhaps we should evaluate so that we can report on what we've done to a funder or something. At this point, your time and your budget is finished. You can't improve on it anymore. Learning and improvements have to be applied in a different project or a different phase, which is quite sad. So this little arrow here shows that a lot of the time we want to just jump into building something, and that happens for many reasons. But one is that you might have a client and people get really wound up trying to get contracts written and agreed and signed, and the client asks something like, when can you get something done? You want to start showing results. So you make some promise about getting something done in the next few weeks. Don't forget that the deliverables, they're not showing here, but those deliverable boxes are completely valid deliverables, especially if you write them down clearly and you make them easy to find and understand. They're tangible deliverables that you can charge money for, that are laying the foundation for working effectively for the remainder of the project. So treat them that way. Let your partners and clients see them that way, and don't feel pressure to skip this step and dive straight into building something. If you did skip over all of this stuff at the beginning, there's a good chance at some point you're going to realize that you don't really have a crystal clear focus on what you're trying to do, what your core objective is. There's a million things you could be doing, and all of this research and things up front provide you a way of evaluating which of those things that you could be doing are actually valid and relevant, and which things are outside of the scope of the project. So you might realize that you do need to jump back and go and do this, or refresh yourself on this if you've done it, but you've kind of lost track of it. These long jumps are pretty expensive because at this point, you've already spent a whole bunch of budget. Now you have to go back. So it's only really this part that's going to be built on the solid foundation of having a clear focus on your project. So I want to go through very quickly this municipal financial portal and show how it might look. And obviously this isn't like a vision statement, and we're not showing personas here. I just have a very brief statement, but we'll use this in the practical later. Under intended outcome, this was really cool when the project lead at our National Treasury just stated as clearly as, the residents need to know their tax, what their taxes should be spent on and are spent on. And they verbatim said the intended users of the site is people who live there because it's their money. And this already really helps you have quite a clear focus on who you're targeting, what you're trying to achieve. Under the state of the world, we know that, or we found that there's financial data available. You can produce financial indicators that help you assess the financial state of a municipality. You've got a database of public officials and politicians, and there are participation processes, political representatives, you can lobby. There's a range of things people can use to effect change. Then what we built was a local government financial portal. It shows contact details, and it shows varying levels of detail of the financial state of the municipality. And then we don't do a great job of evaluation here. Like I said, the best we have is that we get CC'd in most emails that get sent to the municipal leadership. But we don't really analyze that. We don't have an aggregated sense of the sentiment or anything like that, or what people are working on. It's mostly based on sort of us remembering what mails have been sent in the last year. So this site was built a few years ago, and recently we've started a new phase of the project. and we're working on a new feature called Metro Focus. And that is about as vague to me as it is to you. But someone wanted to look at what sets major cities apart from the rest of the country. We know there's performance data available for the metropolitan municipalities, and that's quite exciting new data. We have some researchers, we asked some researchers to explore what you can tell from this data, what makes metropolitan cities different from others, and they provide a really interesting analysis. It was super cool. We built some little indicators using this data, and the design for that indicators was already done on another project, so we didn't put too much effort in here. It didn't cost a lot. We just needed to think how to take this output from the researchers and decide how we're going to make it available to the public. Is it going to be like an interactive page, or I don't know, just one PDF you can download? And someone asked the question, who's interested in this information? What can they do with this information of the difference between rural cities and municipalities? Will they understand the significance of it? Are we presenting this to like a person of average education level or to experts? Like, how do we want to visualize this data? And are we talking about 20% of the population or 0.1% of the population that will get any value from this feature? Like, how much effort should we put into this? We clearly jumped into building and trying. So we start thinking back to the beginning of the project, like, who are our personas again? Did we have personas for this project? These are real questions we were asking. What's the overarching goal of the project? And while this sort of identity crisis in a project can be quite scary, as we go through these early steps, what actually ends up is we start feeling more confident and less stressed than we actually were. And we didn't realize that we were actually a bit stressed about the project when we kind of dove into this build and try area. So I touched on fear now again, and I want to plot fear on a chart. So let's do it first for a project where we're not evaluating while we're iterating. You might start here at the beginning with medium fear, and you've got a bit of apprehension and skepticism, but of course that's an average of the team. Some people are pumped. And as you go along learning about the problem space, you gain confidence. You fear the unknown, so as you're learning, you get more and more confident. Then you start putting things out there. You start building something, and you work and you work. And if you're not assessing how well you're doing, and you just keep working and working, this fear that builds, I think back to that list of fear at the start of the presentation. Is anyone using it? Or they're using it, but they're not changing, like this isn't changing the world in any way. Is all of our energy going to waste? If we evaluate regularly as part of the cycle, you can have these little short steps of building something. You have some excitement, you have some apprehension, you get some feedback, and they're helping you course correct, showing whether you're on track or not. Even if the feedback is that your tool isn't being used, or that you missed something really important, you now know where to focus your energy, and you know soon enough, you know that you'll soon enough hear whether your course corrections were actually helpful, or whether you should do something different. So you end up with this nice bound on the team's fear and worries. I'm not going to go too much into user testing. That's later, and there's a lot of material on YouTube and blogs and books and courses. What I want to touch on is how much user testing to do. It generates a massive amount of data, and you can get inundated and overwhelmed very quickly, and have more feedback from users than you'll ever be able to use, and that's wasteful. So work smart, and while you're thinking about how your testing can be representative of the different users, and avoid bias, also keep focus of what question you want to answer. And so even a little bit of user testing, a few people here and there, can teach you a lot. I want to give you another example of where we're looking at some conversations that came out of one of our recent attempts to bring testing back into our process. We're building this tool to help young people, to help people understand the local government planning process. We think it looks awesome, but we realize we've done a lot of work without speaking to users. So we start speaking to users. One of the things that stands out is that some people are unable to find when the opportunities for participations are in their municipality and where they need to go. We thought we wouldn't be able to get that information. So we just carried on we focused on unpacking the process of participation. But actually hearing users raise this problem, it reminded us how important this issue is of finding the exact date and time of those opportunities. So if we look at this Venn diagram, of people that are actually participating in an informed manner, you've got this one group of people that are able to prepare feedback and understanding the draft plans that they need to interrogate and comment on. And assuming that our tool is helping them to understand this and to unpack it. And so these people are able to like really engage with the process well. Then there's the group of people who know when and where feedback opportunities are. They're able to find them. If only these people are able to actually do that participation, it's a tiny group that's left that we're actually helped by our tool. Because it doesn't help if you have good feedback, but you don't know where to direct it. So it really showed us that we really do need to pay attention to this area of where the feedback opportunities are. It also, we also noticed another issue. As we were discussing what we've learned, we realized that we kind of forgot part of the strategy of the project. The strategy was that we would be deploying this tool with municipalities. And if they're actually part of the project, if it's them that are deploying it on their website, we have contact with them. So we can get this data of when these exact meetings are and where they are, where people need to send their feedback. So like that data should really actually be part of the tool. It can be part of the tool, and it can get a lot of emphasis on the tool. So what this was showing us is that there's this problem in handing over the strategy as a project is conceived to the team that are implementing it. And the team go off on this tangent that is disconnected from the real thing that we believed when we conceived the project that would enable the project. So I think that is, before we go on to the approach, I think I'll introduce what we're going to do for the practical and then pause for questions on the approach. No, let's do this first. Any questions on our approach? I'm going to go back to this one that has this, the busy one. Any questions here? Cool. Sounds like we're crystal clear. Cool. Then I'm going to just say what we'll do. And I think we are few enough people to just do it in one big group. But we can always do split up and do another one. So let's try this process on one of your projects. We'll each have a workspace that looks like this, and I'll explain it in a moment. And I want sort of everyone to try and, I want someone to basically present or represent one of their projects, either an idea they have, or something that they've done, especially if they've sort of gone into the project and they're not really sure about the early research stuff. And we can ask these questions and interrogate those things a bit and try and define to define those early stages. And let's see what we learn. So I've got some slides that we could use. I'll share a link in a moment. And I've got these questions in place, so you can you know what questions to ask but you can also come up with your own, and you can just edit these boxes where it says replace this text and throw in your answers to these things, and you can also just add more things to it. But yeah, someone please represent one of their projects. And for feedback, I think the questions we want to then look at are like, what stood out most from you from that exercise? Did you identify any gaps in your project's foundation? Do you have any new concerns or any new confidence in your project? And are you planning on changing anything in your project? So could everyone go to this bit.ly link, bit.ly/civicproj1a. I'm just going to put it in chat as well. And maybe I'll put that on the screen. And keep it in edit mode, then we can just all edit it collaboratively. So who wants to volunteer their project? I can also pitch my project, and you guys can tear it to shreds.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know you all have great projects, so also a good opportunity to share about your own projects, but yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's try mine, but I'm going to need some challenging questions to help answer this. So my project is called Public People. And yeah, let's just do a bit of background. Basically, where I'm at is I'm building and trying stuff. So I don't know if I've never written down. I've written these things down a bit, but let's just do it in this exercise. What I'm doing on this project is I'm what do you call it? I'm scraping news, and I have a database of politicians, and I search for their name in the news. And for each politician, there's then one page where you can see all the news where their name came up. So you could very easily like do some background research on any politician in South Africa, if I've got their name correct. And that doesn't work very well when there's two with the same full name, but it works well enough. So yeah, the intended outcome, I guess, is that I would like people to, and I think what might work here is if you ask some more probing questions, if you think this isn't very clear, to try and clarify this vision. But let's just start with something like, people are able to understand who politicians are, for example. yeah, any questions or challenges or something with that?
Yeah, I mean, to me, so understanding who politicians are, kind of, I guess, in what like measure, or like, you know, I guess what facet of who they are, if that makes sense. Like, do we need to know where they went to school and how many children they have, and, you know, those kind of things? Or like, it, to me, it's unclear of like what exactly what facet kind of you're looking to highlight about these politicians, or like what you what you want people to know about the politicians.
Right. Let's try. People are able to see whether politicians have a record of good or bad. Behavior isn't a great word. Let's write behavior so long and then see what happens. Something like that. Yeah, let's try like who's involved in your intervention. So I started with me. An everyday citizen interested in politics and governance. And what motivates me here is like, if I'm working with, like if I see a name of a politician in the news and I want to know who they are, I don't recognize their name. I don't have any, I kind of want to judge them, and I want to know, is this a good person or a bad person? So but I don't know why I want to know that, because I'm not like currently voting for them. Yeah. In the state of the world, we know there's a public database of politicians. There's news. There's website with Hansard, and a Hansard is basically what gets said in Parliament. What we don't have in South Africa is like a record of how each politician voted, that some other countries have. No record of politician votes. So what people can do, I mean, they could Google, could use existing oversight or websites, like this website with the Hansard.
Well, actually, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
Under how could users succeed? So under that, is that like, how could they succeed in doing this currently without the, like without your tool or app or product?
Yeah, I guess what I have in mind there is like, I think, yeah, primarily that's, well, it's both. So if I jump back to, it's not going to work very well here, but let's do Summit. There we go. And I think we're, I'm realizing I get a little bit confused in my own system, which is good because then we can clarify it.
Yeah, and this is something that you just kind of this framework came up with to an extent. I mean, I'm assuming with like experience and kind of examples of other frameworks, but this is kind of something you've developed for yourself and your team.
Exactly, yeah. This is a tool that I'm coming up with to have something to point to while I'm trying to ensure that the team has what they need to succeed. So under artifacts so basically these things, the reason they're like separate but in parallel is from a conversation with a user experience designer who said before wireframes you kind of need the information architecture and you need some storyboards and user journeys, because user journeys are what you're gonna, and user stories are what you're gonna end up wireframing and designing your intervention with. But you also want to know sort of what information is out there, what are you able to actually utilize, and so what exists in the world. So I think, yeah, but you do kind of need to be looking at the actions users could be taking in conjunction with what's out there. So I guess on this side, we're looking more at like user journeys, which are forward-looking, assuming that we've made something. But I think a lot of the time, an intervention is really just helping. So if we take this, for example, if we didn't build this website, a lot of this data is already public, just in less accessible places and less accessible ways. So before this website existed, what you'd get in Google is just more technical documentation, or actually, like I showed in that slide of the site not showing up in search results, that's that site. So the official central place for this information doesn't show up in Google, and it still doesn't. But you would get these odd little bits. You could go and ask the municipality for their financial information, and they ought to be providing it. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's all clear. Thank you.
Cool. So then if I come back here, like people could be Googling and finding their politicians. And my issue with Googling for your politicians is that you get all the sensational stuff, but you miss out like these sort of less, these things that are less shared and less popular. And so you get a very like unbalanced view of a politician. So yeah. What's also come up here under who's involved is that, but maybe I should say, sort of after speaking to people, I've realized that journalists do use this as well. I don't really know how to fit that in, but let's just throw it in there for background research. And I think they're actually using it more for background research than what normal people are using it for. So yeah, forward-looking, people could Google, people could use existing oversight websites, and then the journey that we're sort of imagining someone could do is they could find a list of articles about this politician, and let's just bring it to the front and give it a background so we can read it. And yeah, so what I've built so far is, I don't think I wireframed anything. I just built it like a really quick prototype. So basically we scrape news and index it and search for person's name to show list of matching articles on a profile page. And I haven't done evaluation really. I did want to mention something that came up. What I did see when I tried it myself, so let's say use it. There's this politician that's been like physically abusing people, in fighting physically, basically. And he was in our parliament, and what I could see very easily is that he was actually convicted about 3 times of the same physical abuse. Which was harder to find before, because if you see 5 news articles in a Google search all talking about the same sort of issue, it's not clear that those are different events. So it did show me that what we're doing here has some uses, and certainly some uses that we didn't anticipate. Yeah, any other questions about this approach?
Maybe actually even back to under like the who is involved. Like, I guess I'm just thinking of like connecting it back to kind of more traditional like stakeholder mapping and kind of that kind of because is it who is involved is just going to like use the yeah, I mean, could it involve more like wider stakeholder kind of engagement, or is it really just the people who are going to specifically use the product or thing?
Certainly stakeholders as well.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, so I mean, you could do kind of like some of the more traditional like community building kind of stakeholder mapping and like stakeholder power mapping and things like that kind of under the who is involved section. That's just something that like came to mind for me, is like personas, of course, for like the users and things of that nature. But yeah, doing some sort of stakeholder map or like power stakeholder map that kind of takes into account like how much influence do these stakeholders have versus how interested they are in those kind of things. Yeah,
exactly. So for example, for a like in the storyboard example, realizing that elected officials are actually part of this whole thing is really important. And like who this person could talk to or could turn to. In a data portal that you build for government, it's quite easy actually to neglect the what ends up as a persona of the data owner, the person who has to like keep the data up to date, and thinking about the capacity inside government to do that. And another one that comes up in the data portal, or like a lot of projects actually with government, is that they might ask for something to look pretty, and you might like think, oh, they're just missing the point. It doesn't, like, pretty isn't as important as usable. But the reason they want it to look pretty is because they need to put it on a slide, and it must look really, really attractive, because they're asking for more funding to keep the site running. And if it doesn't look slick, then that actually harms the project's long-term sustainability. So absolutely, like you want to cast your net wide. And yeah, so what this doesn't depict very well is that sort of you're looking along this all the time. And as you sort of start exploring storyboards and things, you're coming back and you're filling in what you missed. And as you're looking at the state of the world, you start realizing that there are actually some bits you've missed out, people that are involved, and motivations and needs that you didn't think about. Cool. I think I'll then move along and wrap up. So if we go to, where do I want to be? Let's go there and there and try my new share again. Are you seeing the workspace URLs again?
Yes. Yeah, we're in the group public people, yes.
So you're not seeing a list of URLs?
Oh, no. We are seeing, yeah, we weren't seeing the URLs.
Cool. Let's fix that. Share this one. There we go. All right. So, yeah, I'd really like to know if we're leading people astray. Like I said, this is like a very big simplification of other like existing processes, and we work on in a very ad hoc way, for better or worse. So yeah, I'd like people to mention if it's an oversimplification or something like that. And I think what might help is more ways of linking to existing processes, defined processes that people will be familiar with, like you've mentioned with the stakeholder mapping. So just to recap very quickly, we looked at a lot of really important considerations that you don't need to be experts in, but I think it helps to be aware of. Whether a project has one person or two or 10, someone should be thinking of these. And it helps, it's maybe a good idea to think what areas you might be neglecting and how you might fill that gap in your team. If it's by someone upskilling or by getting by contracting someone. I want to touch briefly on Agile and Scrum. I've spoken on a very abstract level. So there's no new thing under the sun, but you don't have to invent these actual concrete processes. And I mentioned Agile and Scrum, but I didn't really talk about how much this follows common practices in user experience design. But just on Agile, it's a set of principles that sort of come from the software industry, and it's derived from commonalities between projects that were successful. It doesn't mean that you're changing direction all the time. It just means that you're trying and learning all the time. Scrum is a methodology for applying the Agile principles in your project. And as humans, we tend to be really bad at handling the sort of complexity that's common in software projects, but especially Civic Tech projects. Methodologies like Scrum bring us tools in the sense of procedures and practices that help deal with our human nature of struggling to hold complexity in our minds. And it helps us identify assumptions and document decisions in easy ways that don't add a massive administrative burden. So I'd really recommend looking deeper into that. And Agile can work very well with government, even though it's easy to think that it doesn't. Partly because it really does actually provide you with tight control and logging of how decisions were made. It's worth having a clear idea of how to sort of map the concepts of Agile project management to approaches that they might be more familiar with, because it might look a bit scary and haphazard. And also to be able to talk about things like fixed cost and variable scope. The way I would put it, fixed cost, variable scope, which is a common way to work for us, and I think for a lot of people in the Agile space, is that to say we recognize that we don't really know exactly what we can achieve. We do know which direction we want to go in. We do know how much money is available right now. There's usually not a blank check available from government. We're just going to make the best impact we can and learn as much as possible. And I want to acknowledge Peter Kuhn of Pondo.co and Jennifer Walker, who really helped me crystallize some of these concepts and understand how to match user experience design to the rest of the process that's commonly followed in the NGO space, but especially for us. Also, thanks Code for All that I could be here, and my colleagues who I've bored to tears talking about this stuff over the last 4 years. And yeah, please feel free to use this. if there, yeah, I'm happy to take more questions or discuss anything further. And hand back to you, Kelly.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or type anything in the chat to everyone. One thing I just wanted to say, JD, well, first off, thank you so much. This is really interesting, and also sharing your these processes with us, because I know I think it's probably a lot of things that kind of everyone in and on Civic Tech projects do already. It's just kind of very nicely organized and kind of like, in a way, at least for a beginning, you know, trying to manage a project at the beginning, it's nice to kind of have quite kind of complicated things kind of organized in a framework like this. I know a lot of organizations kind of work in different ways and probably have their own frameworks for things like this. And actually, just as kind of Code for All specific, it just made me think it might be really nice to kind of have a space where we have things like this that different members are creating and using on their own. So I think that would be a really interesting conversation to have, and maybe you know, kind of further. Oh, sorry. Hold on. Yes, I live. My office is right on the facing a very large street, so I always get these sirens, and I'm pretty sure I live very close to a what is it called? Not a police station, but a fire station. So I get a lot of these sirens. But yes, anyway. So as I was saying, it might be nice to kind of have more of the Code for All members together to kind of talk about these different processes that they do. And so that just, I wrote a note for later once Summit is over that I could come back to that. Yeah, but yeah, does anybody have any questions or anything they want to add before we leave this session for today? Yes. No? All right. Lastly, again, thank you so much, JD, and thank you all for attending.